We're going to continue graphing sine and cosine curves. This time what we're going to do is we're going to look at our frequency and our period. So we've talked about our A and our C values. Our A value has to do with our amplitude. The absolute value of A is our amplitude. We've talked about our C values. That's our midline, how it shifts up and down. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at our B value, and our B value is our frequency. We use the B value in order to figure out our period, and the formula for our period is 2 pi over B. This is when it completes a full cycle. So whatever our frequency is, that gives us a direction of basically how often it completes a period. The horizontal compression would be when our B value is really large, and a horizontal stretch is going to be when our B value is in between 0 and 1. So when we're graphing this, the first thing that we have to do is we have to figure out our period. And our period is always going to be 2 pi over our frequency. And our frequency is the number in front of theta. So 2 pi over 2 gives us pi. So how that affects it is that since it's larger, it's going to be a compression, meaning that we're going to finish the cycle sooner than what we would normally do. Or we can think of the frequency as in radians being 2 pi, we're going to have actually 2 cycles. That's what the frequency means. So what we have is we have 0, and then instead of pi halves, we have pi fourths because we're dividing everything by 2. That gives us pi halves, and then 3 pi over 4, and we end at pi. So our period is now pi. Instead of ending at 2 pi, it ends at pi. The same y values we're going to be using. So when we're looking at this, we're just writing it as y equals, and then we just plug in our normal sine values. So we have 0, 1, 0, -1, and 0. So notice that nothing changes except we could kind of think of it as our x values, our theta values. So we start it at 0, it goes up to 1, back to 0, down to 1, and then back to 0. So it completes the full cycle, and you notice that when I did this, instead of, I just got in the habit of writing 2 pi, but it should not be 2 pi, it should just be pi, because we end the full cycle at pi. So looking at the next one, we're going to do the same thing. First thing that we want to do is figure out our period, because that's when our table ends. And so it's always 2 pi over our frequency. Our frequency is 1/3. So I'm going to use keep change flip, and I'm going to multiply it by 3 over 1. And so that would be the period being 6 pi. So when we're looking at our table, we're starting it at 0. And what we're doing is we're ending it at 6 pi. We're multiplying all of our values by 3. So what we have is 3 pi over 2. We have 3 pi. We have 9 pi over 2. And then, of course, we're ending at 6 pi. So when we're graphing this, we're going to use our same cosine values that we've always been using. We're going to kind of write it as a linear equation. So y equals 3, and then we're going to plug in all of our values, plus 1. So our first cosine value is 1. 3 times 1 is 3, plus 1 is 4. Then what we do is we plug in a 0, and that gives us a 1. We plug in a -1. That gives us -2. We go back to 1 and 4. So what we have is, when I said 4, we end this at 6 pi, not 2 pi. And then we go up to 4, and then we go down to -4. So we have 0, 4, then 1, and then -2, and then back to 1, and then back to 4. So this right here gives us our graph. Notice that we talked about last time our midline. So our midline is +1, and notice that at +1. And then the distance from the middle to the peak is 3 because our amplitude is 3. So looking at our next one, when we're trying to figure out our period, this time it's 2 pi over 3. So that means when we're looking at our table, what we have is we're starting it at 0 and we're ending it at 2 pi over 3. Since we're dividing all of the values by 3, it becomes pi over 6. It becomes pi over 3, and it becomes pi halves. Now, our normal y values. Our normal sine values would be -2, and then what we have is parentheses. So we're multiplying everything by -2. So our first sine value is 0, so that would be 0. Then what we have is 1, that would be -2, back to 0. And then we have -1, which of course would be 2, and then back to 0 again. We're ending this at 2 pi over 3 because that's our period. That's when it completes the full cycle. And then we're going to go up 2 and we're going to go down 2. So what we have is 0, 0, then -2, 0, +2, and then back to 0. Notice that sign is going in an opposite direction. And we would have figured that out because when our a value is negative, it means that it goes in the opposite direction. Pause the video and try the next 3 on your own and see how you do. First thing that we do is we start with our period. Our period is 2 pi over 1/2. This right here means divided by 2, so that would be why it's 1/2. Keep, change, flip means that we multiply by the reciprocal, so that gives us 4 pi. So when we're looking at our table, what we're doing is we're starting it at 0, and then we're ending it at 4 pi. So it's 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and of course we end with 4 pi. Now, when we're plugging in our values, we're going to go y equals, and then we're going to take our sine value minus 1. So our first sine value is 0, so that would be -1. Then what we're going to do is we're going to plug in a 1, and that would be 0. Then we plug in a back to 0, and that's -1. And then we plug in a -1, and that's -2. And then, of course, we go back to 0, which gives us our -1. So when we're graphing this, we're going all the way to 4 pi. And so we have 0, -1. Then we go back to 0, and then back to -1, and then to -2, and then back to -1. And so it looks like our normal sine curve. Once again, we see that our vertical translation, or our midline, is the -1, and our amplitude is just 1 because there's just a 1 for the a. So for the next one, once again, we're looking for our period, and our period is 2 pi over 2, which of course is just pi. So when we come up with our table, we're starting it at 0, we're ending it at 2 pi. We're taking all our values and dividing them by 2, so pi fourths, pi halves, and 3 pi over 4. So we're going to plug in our y values. So our y values for cosine, so that would be whatever our cosine values are, minus 2. So our first one is 1. 1 minus 2 is -1. Then what we do is we plug in a 0, and that would be -2. We plug in a -1, -3, back to -2, back to -1. So we're graphing it. Our period is, oh, I put a 2 pi there. Our period is just pi. So what we have is we have a pi, and we go up to 3, and we go down to -3. And so when we graph this, what we have is 0, -1, -2, and that should be -3, -3, back to -2, and then back to -1. So this right here is our graph. Notice that midline's -2. We see that would be the middle of the graph, and our amplitude is still 1, just like the last one. Okay, last one. First thing we're going to do is find our period. So the period is 2 pi over 4, meaning that the period is equal to pi halves. So that means when we're coming up with our table, we started at 0, we ended at pi halves. We're taking all of our values and we're dividing them by 4. So that gives us pi eighths and pi fourths and 3 pi over 8. Our cosine values when we write this would be y equals negative, and then we have plus 2. So our first cosine value is 1. Negative 1 plus 2 is 1. Then what we have is 0. That would be 2. Then we have negative 1, which is a negative. Negative is a positive, so that would be 3, back to 2, and 1. So it ends at pi halves, and it goes up to 3. And so when we plot this, what we have is 0, 1, 2, 3, back to 2, and then back to 1. And we knew it was a cosine curve going down because 1, it says cosine, and it's a negative.